Most people spend their entire lives running from silence without ever asking why silence scares them so much. From childhood, you were trained to believe that being alone meant something was wrong with you, as if isolation was proof that you had failed socially, emotionally, or psychologically. The world taught you to fear empty rooms, quiet nights, and distance from the crowd because a person who becomes comfortable alone becomes difficult to influence. The moment you stop needing constant validation, something dangerous happens. You begin to think for yourself. That is why society constantly pushes connection as the ultimate answer to human existence. You are told to stay visible, stay social, stay available, and never disconnect for too long. But beneath all of that advice hides another reality that very few people are willing to confront. People who learn how to stand alone without collapsing often develop a kind of strength the crowd cannot understand. They become harder to pressure, harder to manipulate, and far less dependent on approval from others. The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene explores this pattern repeatedly throughout history. Again and again, the people who maintained power the longest were rarely the loudest or the most socially dependent. They were individuals who understood the value of strategic solitude. They knew how to separate themselves from noise long enough to see reality clearly. And once a person learns how to do that, their perception changes forever. But there is an important distinction that most people misunderstand. Solitude and isolation are not the same thing. In Law 18 of Greene's work, he warns against building fortresses to protect yourself because isolation can become dangerous. At first glance, that sounds like a contradiction. How can solitude be powerful while isolation is dangerous? The answer lies in motive. One comes from strength, while the other comes from fear. When a person retreats because they are terrified of the world, they slowly become trapped by their own walls. Fear-based isolation weakens judgment because it disconnects you from reality itself. History is filled with rulers who surrounded themselves with comfort, loyal followers, and emotional protection until they lost touch with the truth. They hid from criticism, avoided discomfort, and eventually became blind to what was happening around them. The walls they built for safety eventually became prisons. Look at Louis XVI retreating into the luxury of Palace of Versailles while his kingdom collapsed around him. He isolated himself from reality, surrounded himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear, and lost the ability to see danger clearly. By the time the mob arrived, the palace could no longer protect him. Fear-based retreat always creates weakness because it disconnects a person from truth. But there is another kind of solitude entirely, a deliberate withdrawal designed not to escape reality, but to understand it more deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in military camps, surrounded by war, death, and uncertainty. He used solitude as a tool for clarity rather than protection. Greene himself spent years studying human behavior in deep observation, quietly analyzing patterns most people overlook. Neither man hid from the world. They stepped back from it long enough to see it clearly. That is the real difference between weakness and power. The weak build fortresses because they are afraid. The strong build laboratories because they want understanding. One hides from truth, while the other searches for it. And, if you are honest with yourself, you already know which one you have been building. Since childhood, almost every story you heard trained you to fear loneliness. The lone wolf was dangerous. The person separated from the group was punished. Heroes always traveled with allies, teams, and loyal companions, while isolation was reserved for villains, outcasts, or damaged people. None of this conditioning happened by accident. Societies depend on conformity to survive. Economies depend on insecurity to function. A person who is comfortable alone becomes unpredictable because they stop performing for approval. They stop buying things to impress strangers. They stop shaping their personality around acceptance from the crowd. They no longer feel desperate to fit into every social environment around them. And once somebody reaches that level of independence, controlling them becomes much harder. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this centuries ago. He wrote that the individual who genuinely enjoys solitude possesses something rare in human society, a self that is complete within itself. But systems built on endless consumption cannot benefit from people who no longer depend on external stimulation. A self-sufficient person threatens industries built on insecurity, comparison, and emotional dependency. That is why modern culture constantly pathologizes solitude. The moment somebody becomes comfortable spending time alone, labels immediately appear. People assume something must be wrong. Maybe they are antisocial, emotionally unavailable, avoidant, or disconnected. Genuine psychological suffering absolutely exists, but not every desire for solitude is dysfunction. Sometimes it is simply independence. The real question is not why you are alone. The real question is, who benefits when you believe being alone is automatically a problem? Because once you begin questioning that assumption, you start seeing society differently. You realize how many systems depend on your fear of disconnection. They need you desperate for validation, because desperation creates obedience. What the greatest strategists understood is something the average person rarely discovers. Solitude is the birthplace of original thought. Nearly every major thinker, creator, philosopher, or innovator eventually separated themselves from the crowd long enough to hear their own mind clearly. Independent thinking cannot fully develop inside constant noise, because group opinion always pressures people toward conformity. Friedrich Nietzsche climbed into the Swiss Alps alone and spent long hours walking in silence while developing ideas that would reshape philosophy forever. Thus spoke Zarathustra was not created in crowded social circles or intellectual parties. It emerged from profound isolation, the kind of silence most people would immediately try to escape. Nietzsche once wrote that the higher a person rises, the smaller they appear to those who cannot fly. That was not arrogance, it was observation. The moment your thinking stops, depending on collective approval, many people lose the ability to understand you. Independent thought always looks strange to minds trained by conformity, and this is exactly why solitude sharpens perception. When you spend enough time alone without constant distraction, something begins to change inside your mind. Other people's opinions slowly stop echoing in your head. Your thoughts become less reactive and more original. For the first time in years, sometimes for the first time since childhood, you begin hearing your own voice clearly. Isaac Newton developed revolutionary ideas during isolation. Charles Darwin spent years in solitude, refining the theory of evolution. Franz Kafka worked alone at night, creating stories that would haunt generations. None of them created despite solitude. They created because of it. The crowd rarely creates anything original. Crowds react, repeat, imitate, and consume. Real creation almost always begins in isolation. And if you are alone right now, you may actually be standing in the same position every creator eventually reaches before producing meaningful work. The difference is whether you use that solitude to build something or continue mourning the absence of constant attention. One of the clearest patterns Robert Greene observed throughout history was the weakness of people who could not stand on their own. Rulers who depended too heavily on allies eventually became prisoners of those alliances. The moment someone realizes you cannot walk away, the balance of power changes instantly. What once looked like friendship, loyalty, or partnership slowly becomes leverage. This happens everywhere in ordinary life, not just politics or history. In friendships, relationships, careers, and business deals, people sense desperation faster than words can hide it. The person terrified of being alone starts tolerating disrespect they should never accept. They stay loyal to people who barely value them because losing the connection feels more painful than losing themselves. That fear changes behavior in ways most people never notice. They laugh at insults disguised as jokes, agree to situations that violate their standards, and constantly reshape their identity to keep others comfortable. They become emotional negotiators, always adjusting themselves to avoid rejection. And eventually they wake up realizing they built an entire personality around the fear of abandonment. But the truth is almost the opposite of what society teaches. The ability to stand alone is actually the foundation of every healthy connection. When you genuinely know you can walk away, your relationships stop being built on hunger. You stop negotiating from weakness because your self-worth no longer depends on whether someone stays or leaves. Ironically, this independence often makes people more attractive. Annalie Rufus explained in Party of One that individuals comfortable with solitude often form deeper relationships precisely because they are not grasping for validation. They are present without desperation. And presence without neediness carries a kind of gravity people instinctively feel. The desperate person repels because their attention feels heavy. The self-contained individual attracts because they are not trying to extract worth from everyone around them. This is not manipulation or strategy in the shallow sense. It is simply human psychology. Neediness pushes people away, while self-sufficiency creates space for genuine respect. This brings us to one of the most important strategic principles hidden inside solitude. When most people begin losing ground socially, professionally, or emotionally, they panic. They chase harder, explain themselves more, and double their effort trying to regain attention. Every insecure move reveals even more desperation, and with every attempt to hold on tighter, they lose more control. But strategists throughout history often did the exact opposite. Instead of chasing, they withdrew, quietly, without emotional announcements or dramatic exits designed to provoke sympathy. They reduced their availability, redirected their focus, and disappeared long enough to regain perspective. When Greene experienced periods of obscurity early in his career, he did not beg the world for recognition. He did not flood people with constant attempts to remain visible. He retreated into work, observation, and writing. The ideas produced during those silent periods eventually outlasted the noise of people constantly demanding attention. Strategic retreat works because it changes several things at once. First, it returns your attention to you. The energy you were wasting trying to convince others to value you suddenly becomes available again. And once that energy is redirected toward your own development, your life begins changing rapidly. Second, distance creates clarity. When you are emotionally entangled with people, you cannot always see situations honestly. Proximity clouds judgment because emotions distort perception. But once you step back, patterns become obvious. You begin noticing manipulation, disrespect, imbalance, and emotional dependency that once felt invisible. Third, strategic absence activates something ancient in human psychology. Human beings naturally value what becomes scarce. When somebody quietly withdraws without bitterness or explanation, others are forced to confront your absence directly. Suddenly, the attention they once took for granted is no longer guaranteed. But this only works when the withdrawal is real. If you retreat physically while mentally obsessing over responses, notifications, and reactions, nothing has changed. You are still emotionally enslaved to the same need for validation. Genuine retreat requires internal disengagement, not just external distance. That means redirecting your focus completely toward your own growth, your work, your body, your mind, your purpose. You become so immersed in your own development that the absence of certain people no longer dominates your emotional world. Their attention becomes secondary rather than central. This process is difficult because most people never learned how to exist without external stimulation. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that the majority of social activity is not true connection at all. It is distraction from the self. Many people stay constantly surrounded by noise because silence forces them to confront emotions, fears, and emptiness they do not know how to handle. That is why forced isolation often breaks people psychologically. Their identity depends almost entirely on external feedback. Compliments, attention, social interaction, and approval become emotional fuel. Once those things disappear, They feel unstable because they never built an internal foundation strong enough to support themselves alone. But individuals who have learned how to sit with themselves develop something rare. They possess an identity that does not require constant witnesses. Their sense of self survives even when nobody is watching, praising, or validating them. That kind of psychological independence is extraordinarily uncommon. Schopenhauer described this as intellectual wealth, the ability to enjoy your own thoughts without needing endless distraction, the capacity to remain mentally engaged even in silence. To people who depend completely on social stimulation, this kind of independence almost seems unnatural. And that is exactly why the crowd often resents people who walk alone comfortably. Your solitude becomes a mirror reflecting their own dependence. Every moment you spend content without approval silently exposes the possibility that they may not need constant performance either. That realization makes many people deeply uncomfortable, so they label you instead. They call you distant, antisocial, intense, arrogant, strange, or emotionally unavailable. Society often attacks what it does not understand. Friedrich Nietzsche warned repeatedly about herd mentality and the invisible pressure groups use to enforce conformity. Most control does not happen through force, it happens through shame. People fear exclusion more than they fear unhappiness. That fear keeps them obedient to group expectations, even when those expectations slowly destroy their individuality. But the moment you genuinely stop needing the crowd's approval, its power weakens dramatically. Judgment loses its emotional hold over you because belonging is no longer your highest priority. Susan Cain explored this in quiet, while examining how modern culture glorifies extroversion as the ideal personality. Talkative, attention-seeking behavior is treated as healthy, while contemplative and reserved individuals are often viewed as defective. Yet history repeatedly proves the opposite. Albert Einstein developed many of his revolutionary insights in isolation. Ludwig Wittgenstein retreated to remote cabins to think clearly. Emily Dickinson lived much of her life in solitude while producing poetry that survived generations. The crowd produces noise because groups naturally move toward repetition. Individuals produce legacy because solitude allows original thought to develop without interference. Every meaningful contribution to history required somebody willing to separate themselves from collective pressure long enough to think independently. And eventually this leads to what might be the most important transformation of all: the conversion of loneliness into sovereignty. Most people never complete this process because they spend their entire lives numbing silence with distraction. Every quiet moment becomes filled with scrolling, entertainment, gossip, or stimulation, because stillness forces confrontation with the self. But solitude contains something most people never discover. Hidden beneath discomfort is access to your real identity, not the personality built for social approval, but the person underneath all the performance. And the longer you remain willing to face that silence honestly, the more difficult it becomes for the world to control who you are. The first stage of transforming loneliness into strength begins with a simple but uncomfortable realization. You must stop treating your solitude like a defect. Most people automatically assume being alone means something has gone wrong in their life, but that belief itself may be the real trap. Solitude is not always evidence of failure. Sometimes it is the exact environment required for self-discovery. Every hour spent away from constant social pressure gives you something increasingly rare in modern life: mental space untouched by the expectations, opinions, and emotional projections of others. Most people never experience true psychological independence because their identity is continuously shaped by the crowd around them. Their preferences, beliefs, ambitions, and even emotions are often borrowed unconsciously from whatever environment surrounds them. But isolation creates distance from that influence. And in that distance, something deeper starts surfacing. You begin noticing how much of your personality was performance, You realize how often your reactions were designed for approval rather than truth. For the first time, you start hearing thoughts that were buried beneath years of noise. This leads to the second stage of transformation, excavation. Solitude forces you into direct contact with yourself. Without distraction, there is nowhere left to hide from fears you avoided, insecurities you suppressed, and desires you pretended did not exist. That confrontation is exactly why so many people run back toward noise the moment silence becomes uncomfortable. Excavation is painful because it destroys illusions. You begin uncovering anger you denied, loneliness you masked with entertainment, and weaknesses you buried beneath social performance. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this process because self-confrontation threatens the identity they carefully constructed. It is easier to stay distracted than to face the truth directly. But Robert Greene repeatedly emphasized one principle throughout his work. A person who refuses to understand their own weaknesses will eventually be destroyed by them. Self-knowledge is not optional if you want power over your own life. And real self-knowledge cannot develop in constant distraction, because distraction prevents honest reflection. The only way to understand yourself completely is to remain still long enough to observe what emerges in silence. Your fears, your envy, your ego, your insecurities, your hidden motivations. Solitude acts like a mirror with nowhere to look except inward. And while most people see that as frightening, it is actually the beginning of freedom. The third stage is integration. Once you uncover those hidden parts of yourself, you stop pretending they do not exist. Instead of denying your darkness, you learn to understand it. That does not mean becoming consumed by anger, selfishness, or destructive impulses. It means recognizing those forces honestly so they no longer control you unconsciously. Greene's entire philosophy of human nature depends on this principle. Polite society constantly pretends people are purely rational, kind, and morally clean. But history proves otherwise. Human beings are ambitious, insecure, competitive, emotional, and sometimes ruthless. Those traits exist whether society acknowledges them or not. The danger comes when people deny those realities inside themselves. What you refuse to confront internally eventually controls you externally. A person, blind to their own ego, becomes easy to manipulate through flattery. A person unaware of their insecurities becomes vulnerable to emotional control. Self-awareness is not weakness, it is defense. History gives countless examples of individuals who transformed isolation into extraordinary power. Dante Alighieri experienced this transformation after being exiled from Florence in 1302. He lost his political position, his property, and his home. He spent the rest of his life wandering in separation from the society that once defined him. Most people would have collapsed emotionally under that kind of loss. But Dante used exile differently. Instead of allowing isolation to destroy him, he transformed it into creation. During those years of displacement, he wrote The Divine Comedy, one of the most influential literary works in human history. The journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise was not merely fiction. It reflected his own psychological descent and transformation. Exile stripped away the distractions, ambitions, and political games that once consumed his life. Isolation forced him inward, and from that inward journey emerged work that survived centuries. What looked like punishment became liberation. Had Dante remained comfortably integrated into political society, history may never have remembered him. His solitude separated him from noise long enough to uncover his deepest creative potential. And that pattern appears again and again throughout history. Seneca the Younger experienced something similar when Nero turned against him. Forced into separation and political isolation, Seneca did not collapse into despair. He used those years to write philosophical works and letters that would influence generations long after the empire itself disappeared. In his writings on solitude, Seneca practiced deliberate discomfort. He intentionally exposed himself to simplicity, scarcity, and isolation because he believed dependence was the real prison. He wanted to prove to himself that external conditions could not control his internal state. That mindset created resilience impossible to develop through comfort alone. Then there was Henry David Thoreau, who withdrew to Walden Pond in 1845. He lived in isolation for 2 years, simplifying his life to discover what was truly essential. The result became Walden, a work that challenged generations to reconsider society's definition of success. Thoreau realized something most people never dare to question. Many individuals spend their entire lives trapped in routines they secretly hate because they fear separation from the crowd. They follow expectations automatically, never stopping to ask whether the life they are pursuing actually belongs to them. Solitude interrupts that conditioning. It creates enough silence for honest questions to emerge. What do you truly value when nobody is watching? What ambitions are genuinely yours, and which ones were inherited from social pressure? Who are you without the performance required for approval? Those questions are uncomfortable because they destabilize false identities. But without asking them, real individuality never develops. Most people remain psychologically dependent on external feedback forever because they never spent enough time alone to separate their authentic self from social conditioning. This is why productive solitude requires structure. Unfocused isolation can easily become destructive rumination, where the same negative thoughts repeat endlessly without resolution. That kind of loneliness slowly corrodes the mind. But structured solitude transforms isolation into growth. Greene himself built his work through long periods of uninterrupted focus. Deep reading, observation, writing, and analysis performed, away from distraction, allowed ideas to mature fully. Every meaningful achievement requires some degree of separation from constant stimulation, because concentration cannot survive endless interruption. That is why rituals matter. Daily habits give shape to solitude and prevent the mind from collapsing inward. Writing, studying, training, creating, learning, building, and reflecting all turn alone time into productive energy rather than emotional stagnation. Purpose gives solitude direction. Another essential principle is intellectual companionship. Physical solitude does not mean intellectual emptiness. Books allow you to enter conversations with minds across centuries. Through philosophy, literature, psychology, and history, you engage directly with individuals who confronted the same struggles. Reading Marcus Aurelius, Schopenhauer, Greene, or Nietzsche is not passive consumption. It is dialogue. Their thoughts sharpen your own thinking and expand your perception beyond immediate emotional experience. Intellectual companionship protects solitude from becoming isolation in the destructive sense. You must also create evidence of your growth. One danger of prolonged solitude is feeling stagnant simply because nobody is externally validating your progress. Without feedback, improvement can become invisible. That is why documenting development matters so much. Track your work, record your discipline, measure your progress physically, mentally, emotionally, and creatively. Evidence builds confidence because it reminds you that transformation is happening even when nobody applauds it. And eventually, when you re-enter social spaces, you will not return empty-handed. You will return carrying substance. Perspective, skill, discipline, clarity, solitude changes presence in ways words cannot fully explain. People sense when somebody has spent time building themselves away from the crowd. Quiet confidence always feels different from performance because it is rooted in something deeper than attention. Part 4. There is a truth most people will never admit openly, because admitting it would force them to confront their own dependence. The crowd often resents the person who can walk alone peacefully, not because that individual harms anyone, but because independence exposes how trapped many people actually feel. Every moment you spend content without constant approval silently challenges the entire system they built their identity around. When you refuse to chase attention, something uncomfortable happens for those around you. Your behavior becomes a reminder that validation may not be as necessary as they believed. Every party you skip, every shallow conversation you avoid, and every moment you choose silence over performance forces others to confront possibilities they have spent years avoiding. That realization creates resistance. So society labels independent people instead of understanding them. You are called antisocial, strange, arrogant, distant, too serious, or emotionally detached, simply because you do not participate in the same endless performance. These labels are often less about your behavior and more about the discomfort your independence creates in others. Friedrich Nietzsche warned constantly about herd mentality and the invisible pressure groups used to enforce conformity. Most social control does not happen through violence or law. It happens through subtle judgment, ridicule, exclusion, and emotional pressure. People are conditioned from childhood to fear standing outside the group because exclusion feels psychologically threatening. But the herd only controls those who still desperately want acceptance. The moment you genuinely release the need for approval, those social weapons lose power. Criticism becomes less emotionally devastating because your identity is no longer dependent on collective permission. You stop negotiating your personality around what earns applause. This does not mean becoming cold or detached from humanity. It means becoming internally stable enough that your sense of self survives disapproval. There is an enormous difference between connection and dependency. Healthy relationships enrich your life, but dependence makes your emotional state hostage to other people's opinions. Modern culture struggles to understand this distinction. Susan Cain documented how deeply society glorifies extroversion while quietly devaluing contemplation and solitude. Talkative, socially dominant personalities are celebrated, while reflective individuals are often treated like incomplete versions of what people should be. Yet history repeatedly contradicts this cultural narrative. Some of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerged not from crowded environments, but from deep periods of isolation. Albert Einstein developed revolutionary theories through solitary thought. Emily Dickinson spent much of her life withdrawn from society while creating poetry that survived centuries. The crowd excels at producing trends, reactions, and noise. Individuals create lasting ideas because solitude gives thought enough silence to deepen fully. Creativity requires separation from collective momentum long enough for original insight to form. Constant social stimulation interrupts that process before it matures. This is why loneliness can eventually become sovereignty when understood correctly. Most people experience solitude only as absence of companionship, attention, stimulation, or distraction. But at a deeper level, solitude can also become space. Space to think independently, space to develop discipline, space to confront yourself honestly. The problem is that modern life trains people to medicate every moment of silence immediately. The second discomfort appears, distractions arrive instantly. Phones, entertainment, gossip, social media, endless scrolling, constant noise. Silence has become so unfamiliar that many people interpret stillness itself as emotional danger. But silence is where your authentic self begins surfacing. Beneath the distractions exists a version of you untouched by performance, a mind capable of independent thought rather than automatic reaction. Most people never discover that deeper identity because they never remain alone long enough to encounter it. The first challenge is learning to stop pathologizing your solitude. Not every period of isolation means something is wrong with you. Sometimes life removes distractions, specifically because growth requires separation first. Before anything meaningful is rebuilt internally, false identities usually need to collapse. And that collapse feels uncomfortable because it strips away borrowed versions of yourself. The personality designed to fit into social groups, the opinions repeated for acceptance, the ambitions inherited from comparison rather than genuine desire. Solitude begins removing those layers one by one until only something essential remains. This process often feels painful because excavation always does. When distractions disappear, unresolved emotions rise to the surface. Old wounds, insecurities, shame, anger, jealousy, fear, regret. Most people immediately run back toward noise at this stage because confronting those emotions directly feels overwhelming. But avoiding them only guarantees they continue controlling your behavior unconsciously. Robert Greene consistently emphasized that ignored weaknesses eventually become vulnerabilities others can exploit. The person who refuses self-awareness remains emotionally predictable because hidden fears quietly direct their decisions. Solitude gives you the opportunity to examine those hidden forces honestly. Instead of pretending darkness does not exist inside you, you begin understanding it consciously. That understanding creates control. Once you recognize your insecurities clearly, they stop unconsciously governing your behavior from the shadows. This integration changes the way you move through the world. You stop performing innocence or perfection because you understand human nature more realistically. You recognize ambition, ego, envy, attraction, insecurity, and power dynamics without needing to deny their existence. That clarity sharpens perception dramatically. History repeatedly shows that exile, isolation, and separation often became turning points for extraordinary individuals. Dante Alighieri transformed political exile into the creation of the Divine Comedy. What seemed like destruction ultimately liberated him from distractions that may have buried his genius permanently. The same pattern appeared with Seneca the Younger, after political isolation forced him inward. Instead of collapsing emotionally, he used solitude to deepen philosophical understanding and create work that survived long after emperors disappeared into history. Isolation became refinement rather than ruin. Henry David Thoreau also understood that separation from society could reveal truths invisible inside ordinary routines. His retreat to Walden Pond was not escapism. It was an experiment in stripping life down to essentials and discovering what remained meaningful underneath cultural conditioning. These individuals were not broken because they spent time alone. They were transformed by it. Solitude forced them beyond superficial identity and into direct confrontation with themselves. And from that confrontation emerged clarity impossible to achieve through constant social distraction. This is why productive solitude requires discipline and structure. Without direction, loneliness easily mutates into rumination, where the mind loops endlessly through anxiety and negativity. Unstructured isolation can slowly become emotional decay if there is no larger purpose, organizing your attention. That is why rituals matter so much. Reading, writing, training, reflection, study, creative work, physical discipline, and focused routines all transform solitude into construction rather than collapse. Structure gives silence momentum. It channels emotional energy toward development instead of self-destruction. You must also build intellectual companionship intentionally. Being physically alone does not mean existing without guidance. Books connect you to minds across centuries that wrestled with the same fears, ambitions, and questions you now face. Philosophy, psychology, literature, and history become conversations rather than information. When you engage deeply with thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, Nietzsche, Greene, or Schopenhauer, you realize your solitude is not unique. Human beings across history faced the same internal struggles long before modern distractions existed. Their ideas provide perspective strong enough to stabilize you during periods of uncertainty. Eventually, something unexpected begins happening. Instead of fearing silence, you start needing it. The constant noise that once felt comforting begins feeling exhausting. Solitude stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like clarity. And once you experience that shift fully, your relationship with the world changes permanently. At that point, you begin understanding something society rarely teaches honestly. Some people are simply built differently, not superior, not inferior, just different in the way they process life, meaning, and energy. While some individuals thrive through constant interaction and external stimulation, others come alive in reflection, depth, and solitude. Forcing those people into endless social performance slowly disconnects them from themselves. Arthur Schopenhauer once observed that ordinary people think only about how to spend time, while thoughtful individuals focus on how to use it. That distinction changes everything. Perhaps your solitude is not evidence of failure at all. Perhaps you simply experience life differently than people who cannot remain alone without distraction. This does not mean every form of isolation is healthy. Fear-based hiding still exists. Some people retreat because they are terrified of rejection, responsibility, or emotional vulnerability. That kind of withdrawal eventually weakens the mind because it comes from avoidance rather than purpose. But sovereign solitude is something entirely different. Sovereign solitude is deliberate. It is the conscious decision to separate from noise long enough to build clarity, discipline, and identity. It is not running from life. It is preparing yourself to engage with life from a position of strength rather than emotional dependence. And only you can determine honestly which form of isolation you are living through. That question matters because your future depends on the answer. If your solitude is rooted entirely in fear, then eventually you must confront the avoidance directly. But if your solitude is becoming a forge for self-development, then you may be standing inside one of the most important periods of your life without fully realizing it yet. Most transformations happen invisibly at first. There are no crowds applauding while identity is rebuilt internally. There is no recognition while discipline forms quietly in empty rooms. Growth in solitude often feels unrewarded because external validation disappears during the process, but invisible development is still development. In fact, some of the strongest people you will ever encounter were shaped precisely during periods nobody witnessed. Alone in apartments, libraries, late-night study sessions, isolated routines, difficult recoveries, and silent rebuilding phases where nobody believed in them except themselves. Solitude became the environment where their internal foundation hardened. This is why your relationship with loneliness determines so much about your future. If you constantly interpret being alone as proof of inadequacy, you will spend your life chasing distractions to escape yourself. But if you begin treating solitude as territory for growth, observation, and refinement, then isolation becomes an advantage instead of a wound. The world constantly pressures people toward performance. You are encouraged to stay visible, reactive, entertained, and emotionally available at all times. Constant stimulation keeps people distracted enough that they rarely examine who they actually are underneath the noise. Solitude interrupts that cycle. In silence, masks begin falling away. The identity built entirely for approval starts weakening because there is no audience left to perform for. That process feels uncomfortable because human beings become deeply attached to their social roles. But once those layers dissolve, something more stable starts emerging underneath them. You begin building a self that is not dependent on applause, a personality rooted in conscious values rather than temporary validation, a mind capable of independent thought even when the crowd disagrees. That kind of internal stability changes every area of life because it removes the desperation that weakens judgment. Relationships improve because you stop clinging. Decisions improve because fear of rejection no longer controls you. Work improves because your attention stops scattering toward endless comparison. Solitude teaches focus by removing constant emotional interruption. And focus is one of the rarest forms of power in the modern world. Robert Greene never wrote to comfort people or gain universal approval. His work endured because he pursued clarity over popularity. He examined human behavior directly, without softening uncomfortable truths, simply to remain socially acceptable. That willingness to stand apart gave his ideas longevity. The same principle applies to your own life. Every meaningful identity requires the courage to separate from collective pressure at some point. If you constantly bend yourself around every social expectation, eventually nothing authentic remains. You become adaptable to everyone except yourself. But solitude gives you the opportunity to rebuild deliberately, to examine your beliefs carefully, to question inherited ambitions, to strengthen discipline without needing external praise, to discover what actually matters when nobody is watching. Those realizations cannot be borrowed from other people. They must be experienced directly. And eventually, when you re-enter the world, you return differently, not louder, not more desperate for attention. Usually, the opposite. People often sense depth immediately in individuals who have spent meaningful time alone. There is less need to prove, less emotional chaos, less frantic performance. Quiet confidence replaces approval-seeking behavior. That presence affects others, whether they understand it consciously or not. People trust individuals who appear internally grounded because stability itself feels rare. Someone who can remain calm without constant validation carries a kind of emotional weight modern culture struggles to produce. This is why strategic solitude is not about rejecting humanity. It is about refusing to lose yourself inside collective pressure. Healthy connection still matters. Love, friendship, loyalty, and meaningful relationships remain essential parts of life. But those connections become strongest when they are chosen freely rather than desperately needed for identity. The person terrified of being alone often enters relationships from emotional hunger. Hunger distorts judgment because survival becomes more important than compatibility, respect, or truth. But the person capable of solitude enters relationships from fullness instead of emptiness. That difference changes everything. You stop accepting crumbs because loneliness no longer feels fatal. You stop tolerating disrespect because abandonment no longer terrifies you. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain approval because your self-worth no longer depends entirely on other people's reactions. Independence creates standards, and standards protect your life from becoming controlled by fear. Fear of exclusion, fear of judgment, fear of silence, fear of facing yourself honestly. Most people spend years trapped inside those fears without recognizing them clearly. But solitude exposes them directly. That exposure can either destroy illusion or deepen awareness, depending on how you respond to it. If you continue numbing yourself constantly, silence will always feel threatening. But if you remain present long enough to understand yourself honestly, solitude slowly transforms from punishment into preparation. Perhaps that is what this period of your life truly represents. Not abandonment, not failure, not evidence that something is wrong with you. Perhaps you are simply being separated from noise long enough to build something stronger internally. Because in the end, the greatest thing solitude can produce is not success, status, or even achievement. It is self-possession, the ability to exist without constantly needing permission to feel valuable. The ability to think independently, even when the crowd disagrees. The ability to remain stable in a world addicted to distraction. And once you develop that, the world's pressure changes. Approval loses power over you. Rejection loses power over you. The crowd loses power over you. Because you finally discovered something most people spend their entire lives searching for outside themselves. A mind capable of standing alone without collapsing long before you existed.